Alright then, so here is our erector set, which of course was produced in a separate scene file from the layout in order to make the other scene a little lighter, allows for better management if we keep it separate, and allows us to lay everything out in front of us in a sort of a logical manner that's easy to sort of interpret, and you know where everything is. Sometimes you reference in erector set stuff into a layout, depending on the complexity of the scene and sort of what you're trying to do, or what kind of a production environment you're in. But for the case of this simple composition, I just went ahead and merged the erector set into the scene under a set of predetermined layers, so that I could manage them and sort of just take what I needed as I needed it, and made out copies or instances of the erector set masterpiece and sort of placed it into the layout. So there's a number of things that I do with the erector set stuff before it goes into the layout, and starts becoming part of the main composition. One of which is sort of just optimizing mesh, keeping it clean and simple, seeing how it's going to react to smoothing based on maybe the distance that I'm going to see it and how I'm going to use it, and if I feel like the mesh is adequate or appropriate, then I'm pretty good with that. We have various flanges and fittings, and these are what were to be the end of the tree roots, the sort of the tree caps or the root caps, and just various points of interests and sort of key pieces that I thought maybe potentially I would be using over and over again. These I knew might end up being more of a one-off type thing, but they tie in with the conduit pipe which I built here, which I'd also intended to perhaps be smaller piping if I needed it as well. And I knew for sure that these plugs and ports and various pipe fittings, clasps and brackets and bolts would be used a lot. They would be used over and over and over and over again. And these flanges too. You can see the level of detail. I try to keep it relatively light and easy. I think I went with 4 sides here for a cylinder, knowing full well this is small and seen, at a distance. So if I go ahead and put a turbo smooth on this, you can kind of see the end result of the piece of mesh. Which is more than enough for what we needed for our composition. And in times I probably went a little too heavy. And when I go and do the poly reduction phase, prior to doing my texturing and rendering and lighting, I will be very thorough to go through and strip out any bit of vertice or point count that I don't really need, and still have the level of detail I need for the final composition. But for now, I didn't let that be a problem because the scene didn't get out of control. One of the other things that I consider when doing an erector set from scratch like this is to have all the UVs processed already for the asset itself. So in the case of this bolt here, if I unwrap it and we take a look at it, you can see that it's ready to go for texturing. And you can instance this out over and over and over again, or copy it out. Put as many as you want in the scene, and you're always going to have the UVs for it. So you don't have to bother copying UVs over later on, or potentially even if things go wrong and you go a little too ahead of yourself, you end up having to possibly even unwrap multiple objects of the same type, especially if you change the point count in any way. It kind of gets in the way. So I like to make sure that all this stuff is UV'd, and then it's a little extra step. It takes you a little longer to get to the mesh layout or even more mesh building, but at least you know that this stuff that you're going to reproduce over and over and over again is very solid and already UV'd, and a lot of the work as you duplicate these objects has actually been done already for you. So you save yourself a lot of time in the end, potentially, if you know you're going to be using this stuff a lot. And I knew in this composition I would be using this stuff a lot. So yeah, that's the erector set. One other point is that all these objects were built to smooth, but I made the decision that the bolts were more than enough to hold up to the render camera. So the bolts were actually left alone, don't have to smooth them. Everything else is built for a level 1 turbo smooth, with the exception of these pipes, which I let be a level 2. I just didn't want to throw in all the geo that would be required to make them a level 1. So there was a bit of faceting that happened, and so I just made the decision to make a smoothing group level 2 for it in the final comp. Alright, so that's the ErectorSet. And let's go back and show how that became part of the integration in the layout. Alright, so we come back to where we left off when we were discussing the previs mesh, or the blocking mesh, whatever you'd like to call it. And so now obviously we had completed the ErectorSet, and we are ready to start bringing in various things. So I brought the whole ErectorSet in on a series of layers and outside of the composition, and started to bring things in. So if we go back to the unsmoothed high-res mesh, you can see right off the bat, once you've seen the ErectorSet, you kind of start to lock on to these key shapes being perforated through the composition. And most of the time I would straight up use the various assets as they were. But then also you had the freedom to go ahead and alter some of them, scale them or tweak them or reduce some of their point count or add more without any real problem. The UVs would withstand that as long as you weren't chopping out whole polys or adding in whole new polys. It tends to handle it just fine, and even then you just go in and that would be a piece that you'd have to remember to go in and fix. But there wasn't too much of that, and quite often not key ErectorSet pieces become sort of the basis for a whole new piece, and you sort of elaborate on it because you want a little bit more from it, or you want to change some of the designs. And sometimes you use ErectorSet pieces in ways to make whole new shapes that they weren't initially, necessarily intended for. You just sort of figure it out. So if I go back to the camera here, so a key interesting point that maybe I can show you guys right now to sort of give you a good sense of why the ErectorSet was important would be if I go to my material editor, just drag it off the screen here real quick, and flag everything that's an ErectorSet piece. You can see now that a great deal of the composition came as a direct result of that ErectorSet and filled in a lot of the blanks. And actually, as I blocked a lot of these shapes here, like these monitors, they weren't thought out yet. So this was really just the same, basic no-brainer monitor that I had done in the initial blocking. And I know it wasn't part of the ErectorSet, but I had used it to sort of form a lot of the composition up. But in the case of all these guys right here, they got used over and over and over again. So I just thought that'd be a good visual aid for us. So let's get rid of the green and go back to the normal composition. So now that we've sort of demonstrated the benefit of the ErectorSet, if I were to just go ahead and quickly hide all this stuff, you can kind of see all the stuff that I had to sort of invent as I went along. Like I said, this was all very much an afterthought for the longest period of time, so that kind of got developed on its own, and there was sort of a mini ErectorSet that I kind of did on the fly. I didn't officially make one, and if I had a bit more time, I would have gone ahead and actually made a whole monitor ErectorSet and gone through all the trouble of designing and sort of figuring it all out and bringing it in, but it actually just became more of a on-the-fly experience. And where I put the bulk of my time, just one-offing models, was actually the chair itself. I had done a loose thumbnail that I quite liked in terms of balance, and sort of went about doing that. This is probably the most complex piece modeling wise. And even then it's not too bad. Like it's really not over the top. Still pretty simple in how it flows, but it definitely had been needed to be thought out a little.